No, it's wonderful to see all the energy, and thank you for being with us on this nice and sunny day. We have a treat for you today. This is our final 30th anniversary lecture, and we've saved some of the best for last. So thank you for being with us and to help celebrate the 30th anniversary and to hear from one of the foremost authorities and leaders in philanthropy. And to facilitate his sharing of his insights with us, we have something of a reunion. He has something of a reunion with our own Professor Katie Harold, who will be facilitating the dialogue with Joel Fleishman and introducing him as well. As you know, Katie Harold is a professor with us, teaches on foundations and civil society, and is also a graduate of that institution over there in North Carolina.
We're in the first class of PhD candidates.
So please join me in welcoming Joel Fleishman and Katie Harold.
I'm pleased to welcome Joel Fleishman, Professor of Law and Public Policy at the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. You all know Joel's work. He's the author of 3 books. The first, The Foundation, A Great American Secret, How Private Wealth is Changing the World, was first published in 2007 and came out in paperback in 2009. His second, which he co-authored with Tom Tierney, chairman of the Bridgestone Group, entitled Give Smart, Philanthropy That Gets Results, was released in March of 2011. And his latest book, Putting Money to Work, Philanthropy Now or Investing for Tomorrow, is on the docket for tonight's conversation and was just released, and is available outside the room.
And I'll sign it if you buy it.
Joel served as legal assistant to North Carolina Governor Terry Sanford, the Sanford School's namesake, from 1961 to 1965. He joined the Duke faculty in 1971, was founding director of what is now the Stanford School of Public Policy, and has served Duke as vice president, senior vice president, and first senior vice president. Taking part-time leave from Duke from 1993 to 2003, he became the president of the Atlantic Philanthropic Service Company in New York City, the U.S. program staff of the Atlantic Philanthropies, which at the time was still anonymous. Today, he is the director of the Stanford School's Center for Strategic Philanthropy and Civil Society, and director of the Stanford School's Samuel and Ronnie Heyman Center for Ethics, Public Policy, and the Professions. On Founders Day, October 1st, 2009, Duke presented Joel with one of the university's highest honors, the University Medal for Meritorious Service. He was chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Urban Institute until stepping down in May 2014, and currently serves on the board of directors of the Ralph Lauren Company. What many of you don't know is the Joel Fleishman behind this impressive work. Joel is a true Renaissance man. He is an aficionado of Mozart. He is a wine connoisseur. He was the Vanity Fair wine columnist for 8 years. So, Patrick, I see you taking notes. I think this is a note to allow Joel to choose the bottle of wine tonight. He has most likely, or almost certainly, walked more miles than you and I combined. And having witnessed an epic debate over one of the South's famous desserts, I can assure you that Joel Fleishman knows his bread pudding. But what is even more special about Joel is his humanity. Joel is one of the most caring, compassionate, and fun-loving people you will ever have the pleasure to meet. Joel, we're blessed to have you here.
Thank you. Very sweet. We enjoyed having Katie as a graduate student, a PhD student at Stanford School. As I said, in the first class of PhD candidates we awarded. And she set a standard by which we are continuing to live. She was focused on nonprofits and philanthropy in that class. We had another student last year who graduated last year, did the same thing, and another student this year who's doing the same thing. We almost want to call them the Katie Herald of fellows in residence.
Well, we should know that one of those doctoral students was actually a graduate of the Lilly Family School's MA program, Danielle Vance Mullen.
She was in the second class.
Yes.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But it is, Katie, a very special human being, and she came to us already knowing a lot about philanthropy. She had worked for the Center for Effective Philanthropy in Boston. She had worked for the Urban Institute's Center on Philanthropy and Nonprofits. She had worked for 2 years at the Bahai Foundation. So admitting her was not a serious challenge. We regarded ourselves as really lucky that she came along and wanted to come to Duke. She tells the story, which I guess is a true story, since she always tells the truth, except when she exaggerates and have her friends, about the fact that when she called me because several friends of mine whom she consulted in some of those organizations I just mentioned told her to call me and ask about the alternative ways that she could get an advanced degree. And she called me and she asked me the question, and I immediately set about recruiting her. I didn't give her time. I didn't tell her about any other institutions. I said, if you really want the best education you can possibly get in what you've said you wanted to do, then you've got to come to Duke. There's just no question about it. And that would, of course, would change now because you have the school, and she's here, and you have a terrific program here. But in any event, she made a great impression on everybody there. We all love her. We might try to steal her back at some point. So don't. If something happens like that, don't say you weren't forewarned. In any event, it really is an honor to be here today because I've long been an admirer. I was telling the dean about some of my prior contacts with the school, and the things that happened here before the school was a school. But I want to say that that you all are publishing here a volume every year called Giving USA, which is mandatory reading by everybody in the world of philanthropy. There is no other book, my own included, this is mandatory reading. This is mandatory reading. And you can just picture my workspace at home where I have the computer and where I write everything I write. Those books are stacked up. They're my books and those in your books. They're stacked up together so that every time a question comes up, I know exactly where to look, mainly in your books. So I thank you for, you created an annual database about philanthropy that is more detailed, more micro, as well as macro, than any other source of data on the nonprofit sector in the United States. That's an amazing achievement. It helps guide public policy, it helps guide legislators, it helps guide scholars. It's an amazing thing. And what you all do in that book, and the reports that you release also, I was talking with Patrick earlier today about, and also the dean, about the new report on donor-advised funds. Donor-advised funds at this point, as you all know, one of the hottest issues at this point in philanthropy. And that report is an authoritative report, basically. Regardless of what Alan Cantor may have said. In criticizing it, it's an authoritative report. Not every report can deal with everything that somebody who reads it wants it to deal with. And I will tell you the report, it's terrific, and something to be proud of, and another one of the achievements of the school. So it is a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I have been here before a couple of times, not while you all have been present, but nonetheless, and I've enjoyed it. I have colleagues here whom I admired, some of whom I met with this afternoon, and it was a great privilege to do that. And I've met some of the students. Some of you in the room have enough fortitude to come here even after hearing me talk to you about your work just for an hour. So what I want to do is just to lead off. Katie is going to ask me some questions. I'm going to lead off with a couple of thoughts about the reason I wrote this book. and why I'm writing it at this point, why I just chose to write it at this point. So I'm going to refer to my notes here just briefly, and I'm going to try to be brief, but I do suffer from one of the same idiosyncrasies that afflicted President John Adams. In a book on the history of the invention of America that Jack Rakove wrote, he says, quote, "For John Adams was a writer whose heart and mind flowed through the quill of his pen, who never used a single well-chosen word when 6 impetuous synonyms would do just as well." Well, I'm not going to tell you, if I were writing a wine column, I might use 6 impetuous synonyms, but I'm not writing a wine column this afternoon, and I'm not going to give you 6 impetuous synonyms. What I am going to do, I'm going to try to be more economic about it. This country is going through a really interesting time. I think probably in all of our lifetimes, it's never been quite like this. And so I have a couple of quotes to read you briefly. These quotes, let me just go on and read them, then I'll tell you what I'm going to say. "Our nation is living today through one of its most perilous periods of time ever. A painful polarization perfuses our politics, gridlocks our national and state governments, and makes our conversations with others awkward and often downright uncomfortable." Anybody want to guess who wrote that? Abraham Lincoln, 150 years ago. And he went on to say, "At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men," you could have said free women, "we must live through all the time or die by suicide." So an important point to mention. I believe we're going to come through this period of time, these years of bitterness, intact and stronger, but not without doing our own part to bring our country together. In these fraught times, let me mention Reinhold Niebuhr's profound observation that seems especially relevant today. "Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary." And you all know Niebuhr, profound theologian, profound thinker about theology, and I agree with him. Let me tell you why I decided to write this particular book at this particular time. It suddenly occurred to me that there was a reason and a movement of people behind the decision to persuade philanthropists to spend their money during their lifetimes. You have to keep in mind the background. From the beginning of foundations in the United States at the end of the 19th century, and all through to the 20th century, there were only a handful, literally, not a handful even, of foundations that chose to spend themselves down. Not all the others were perpetual foundations by definition. It was the default approach to philanthropic distribution of accumulated wealth. Then suddenly, about 1990, the landscape started to change. And in the book, you'll see I touched on a number of different fields in which philanthropy is different today than it was in 1990, for the better. The one that I said that I have serious doubts about is the movement towards spending one's wealth in their lifetimes. And I asked myself the question, why did that happen? Why did it happen then? And what I came to the conclusion was that the philanthropists who are basically right-wing in their orientation had decided that perpetual foundations are all, virtually all the large perpetual foundations are centrist or liberal, left of center. And their assumption was that there had to be a conspiracy for that to happen. That there was no way in the world that the donors could have wanted to create, being rich people and being conservative, they thought, could create foundations that accorded with their interests and values and still be left, center, and centrist. And that assumption made by those people was based on, triggered by a domino that started falling when Henry Ford II resigned from the board of the Ford Foundation. The articles talked about the Ford Foundation. You see it still today. The Ford Foundation being the exemplar, the poster child of departure from donor intent. Well, nothing could be farther from the truth. There's a whole chapter in the book about why that's true. The fact of the matter is that Henry Ford II was put on the board of the Ford Foundation by his father when he was in his 30s. And he served on the board of the Ford Foundation for 40 years. He was the only member of the foundation who served on the board of the Ford Foundation. He served as a trustee, as chairman of the board, as president of the foundation, and he served, it was the person who appointed really every president of the Ford Foundation, and he also appointed the committee that was charged by the board with writing a mission for the Ford Foundation. So, was there ever any donor intent expressed? No. Literally. So if there were no donor intent expressed, how in the world could you have departure for donor intent? And yet, the right wing in philanthropy and observers maintained that it was in fact a departure for donor intent, from donor intent. So the problem is, he participated in every major decision of the Ford Foundation for the 40 years he was on there. When he resigned, he wrote a letter to Alexander Hurd, the chairman of the board of the Ford Foundation, and said, "This foundation is terrific. It's done wonderful things. I'm proud of it. I'm proud of my service on the foundation, and anything I can do to help the foundation advance itself, I'm eager to do." Does that sound like somebody who's departed from donor intent? No. And so you get, the problem was that the Wall Street Journal, in its coverage and its editorial coverage of Henry Ford's departure from the Ford Foundation board, and other philanthropists began to pick up the notion that Henry Ford II was frustrated with the foundation. There's even a newspaper article claiming he stormed out of a board meeting, literally. Well, that's fiction. He never stormed out of a board meeting. There's plenty of testimony to that effect. It didn't happen. And neither did the departure from donor intent happen. Yet, starting about this happened, he resigned from the board of the Ford Foundation in 1976, covered in the newspapers in 1977, and from that point on, as foundations began to be created, the first significant one of which was the John M. Olin Foundation, which is a major foundation supporting the conservative infrastructure in policy and other kinds of things. This is the foundation that is really more than any other foundation, not alone, with other foundations like the Bradley Foundation and others that joined them in their efforts. But it was a foundation that what they did was to create organizations like the American Enterprise Institute for Social Policy Research, which is a respectable conservative organization. And then some that weren't so respectable. They also made grants to universities, to other think tanks, and other scholars. 4 members of the Supreme Court today are members of the, what's the name of the organization? The conservative organization of lawyers?
Federalist.
Federalist Society. Federalist Society was created by the Olin Foundation. And so, I think our national discourse on public policy is richer today because of the existence of that conservative policy infrastructure. I applaud it. That doesn't mean I agree with everything they've done, but anybody who lived through the 60s, the 50s and 60s, watching these things, know that the discussion about public policy issues, particularly dealing with poverty and other kinds of things, was very, very not unexciting, for example, and not very creative for the most part. Lyndon Johnson administration created things, Franklin Roosevelt created things, but in terms of the discussion about policy change during those periods of time, it was pretty tame, pretty ordinary. But with the beginning of the conservative infrastructure organizations to start commenting on public policy, the fact is it's become much richer and much more varied, and the public gets a chance to think of things in a way they never would have otherwise. So in principle, I like the idea of that kind of those differences, But at the same time, I reserve the right to disagree with them. The long and the short of it was, you look at the number of people now, starting about 1990, after Owen's decision was made in the 80s, and he created that foundation to spend down, and it is now spent down. It's gone. And they put a lot of money into the building of that conservative infrastructure. But there are a number of other foundations. You read, how many times have you read in the newspapers about this or that billionaire from Silicon Valley who has decided to spend his money down? And often they will refer to the departure from donor intent. The problem is that too is a bit of fiction. I've gone through the list of every single major foundation in the country, the largest 25 in any event, and I can't find one foundation that has departed from donor intent. The theory of the conservatives was, and if you look at what the Philanthropy Roundtable writes in its journals and publishes in its reports, they will tell you they discourage their donors from creating perpetual foundations because they inevitably will depart from donor intent, and what's more, they'll not only depart from donor intent, they will go left. There's not a single example among the top 25 where that happened. Not one. And yet they continue to preach that. So, you know, the answer is why, so why in fact, I came to the conclusion that, so the movement really, and I believe still, that the movement towards spending down occurred as a result of people's beginning to believe what the conservative philanthropists were saying. It's not true. But they still, nonetheless, many still believe it. And it leads to perverse results. First of all, it encourages people who might be tempted to create perpetual foundations not to create perpetual foundations. That's their goal. The goal is they don't want any more liberal foundations, centrist foundations. They want only foundations that are going to go out of business and can't become liberal foundations. What they don't realize is that the donors of those foundations, all the perpetual foundations, put their own personal stamp on those foundations. How could 25 major billion-dollar foundations all be centrist and liberal if the donors hadn't intended that? And you can take them one by one if you want to. Just take it from me, and you can check up on my facts as you like. Look at them yourselves and ask yourself the question. Look at what their donors said, what they did with them, and it seems to me to speak for itself. So the goal, I think, of their effort, and I've challenged Adam Meyerson, who's the president of the Philanthropy Roundtable. I sent him a copy of the book. He's a good friend. I admire what they're doing. They're doing some good stuff there. They're defending the nonprofit sector in a very effective way with the conservative members of Congress and others, and trying to keep them from doing crazy things to the nonprofit sector. They don't succeed in everything, but nonetheless, they've tried very hard to do that. And you know, my sense is that the goal all along has not been so much to get people to spend the money during their lifetimes. The goal all along has been to stop people from creating perpetual foundations because they don't like the idea of having more foundations that are basically liberal or centrist. So that's what led me to it. I suddenly woke up one morning and I said, that's why this is happening. And in the book, I spell all of this out, that you can see the facts that they're based on. So are the people who are spending down conservative? Not necessarily they are. Many of them are liberals. But they've been persuaded that the thing that they should do with their money, for fear that it might go astray, has been to have them spend it all during their lifetimes. The book, I'm very strongly in favor of both time-limited giving and also time-unlimited giving, because I believe that both kinds are needed. When I look at the American nonprofit sector and where the money came from to start all of these organizations that we all love and admire, like the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is the largest foundation, the largest nonprofit organization focusing on the environmental protection. It was started by 4 graduates of the Yale Law School in 1967. And today it has 1.5 million dues-paying members. The Environmental Defense Fund was started the next year, in '68, and the Ford Foundation was again one of the major contributors, but so were other foundations. that organization has 2 million paid donors. Probably not a drop of the money that was given to those organizations was given by spend-down donors. Look at organization by organization, the perpetual foundations have provided the social capital banking source. So that any individuals who want to start organizations, they know where to go. These organizations advertise what they do, they open to proposals, and so many of the large nonprofits are started by, not only started by, but are nurtured for 20 or so years until they can reach sustainability by perpetual foundations. Not the spend-down foundations. Spend-down foundations typically are animated by people who are trying to get a major impact in a short period of time from their dollars. They tend to be very wealthy individuals who've made a lot of money and who've been made very successful, like Mark Zuckerberg in business, or like any other person starting a startup that's become a billion-dollar organization. They've achieved enormous success, and that provided great psychological benefit to them personally. And they are trying to get the same kind of results from their charitable giving, their social sector giving, that they got from the same kind of psychological benefits that they got from their for-profit enterprises. That's not a good motivation for philanthropy. And it's all the more, I believe that there's a place for spend-down foundations because there's some problems that can be mitigated, diminished, if you do spend money early. Reaction to famines, reaction to natural disasters, reaction to providing food for the hungry, reactions to providing housing for the homeless. Those are all kinds of things where you can in fact make a significant difference to a number of people who are harmed by what the problem, and you can do something about it, you can see the results. But those aren't the kinds of things typically that the big donors in spend-downs want to achieve. They want to solve global warming, or they want to solve inequality, or they want to solve any other large number of complex problems that cannot, by any reasoning person, figure out how to solve them in a short period of time. These are people who are setting up the Gates Foundation is scheduled to spend down 20 years, no later, it starts spending down no later than 20 years after the death of the survivor of Bill and Melinda. Are they in fact spending down at this point? No. I mean, they can't spend down because they've got so much money to spend in the short run. They're not touching capital. Atlantic Philanthropies did spend down. It did go from giving away about $7.5 billion to the point where it doesn't have any more money to spend. So it spent capital and everything else. The Gates Foundation is not spending capital. It's spending about $4 billion a year in grants, about half of which is coming from their endowment, which is in the 40 billion mark, somewhere around 43, 44 billion at this point. And what else? Warren Buffett's gift in 2006 that is required by Buffett to be spent during the year following his gift. So they have an aggregate of $4 billion to spend every year, haven't touched a dollar of capital. So they may start spending down at some point, but they're not spending down at this point because they're not spending capital. So, my point is, and that's what other foundations behave like that, do the same kinds of things. It's the perpetual foundations. Perpetual foundations are not spending capital either. They're trying to protect their purchasing power, and they want to be around to work on problems on a continuing basis. And that's what the Gates Foundation looks like at this point. And my view is it's entirely possible they may change their mind when they later on and become a perpetual foundation, because you're not going to solve most of these health problems. Maybe they will develop a malaria vaccine. Maybe they will develop an AIDS vaccine. Maybe they will purify all the unclean water in Africa. But it's not likely. And you have to keep at it. These are all problems that require, nobody has a solution that they're sure is going to solve the problem. And so if a person cares about giving their money away, all their money in the short run, where's the money going to come from them to fine-tune the solution so that it really does seek to serve its purpose. If you've given away all your money, you don't have it anymore. And therefore, you can't do the fine-tuning that every one of the perpetual foundations can do because they're perpetual and because they can take small bites out of a problem until they actually reach the point where they know how to deal with the problem. So the long and short of it, I hadn't intended to talk this long about that issue, but as you can tell, I feel very strongly about the role of perpetual foundations. I believe there's a question mark after spending now and investing for the future, but I say at the end of the book, both of them are essential. There's some kinds of problems that can be dealt with in the short run, and donors who want to do that should do it. They should be permitted by law to do it. But for other kinds of problems, you need perpetual foundations around to do it. Which are the foundations that are working most on the problem of global warming? They're all perpetual foundations. Packard Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, each put up $500 million over 5 years to create Climate Works. And they've attracted 17 other foundations to work with them, all of which are perpetual foundations. So, you know, you look at these problems and they're the ones that have the guts and the durability to deal with these problems constructively. And they know that. You don't see any spend downs putting money into that kind of problem. And yet, it's those kinds of problems, essentially, that most people are upset about and would like to see something about it, and particularly when the U.S. government is getting out of the business of trying to protect the environment, and in fact allowing more pollution to occur than anybody thinks desirable. So I'm going to stop there for the moment, and now turn it over to Katie, who has some questions to ask me.
Well, Joel, I'd like to pick up on the comment you made about being in favor of both perpetual and spend down, depending on the circumstances. And I want to note that you have spent years studying the spend down of the Bahai Foundation, a particular foundation, studying the strategies that Bahai used, the challenges that that foundation encountered, and in your book you discuss some of the strategies, the opportunities for spend downs, and the strategies that particular foundations use.
The Bahai Foundation is it is unlikely that somebody who has been paid by a foundation to basically to detail what they've done in their spend down, to criticize them. But I've now done annual reports to the Bahai Foundation about the progress and difficulties of its spend down. It started. The founder's name is Bernstein, Solomon Bernstein. He changed it when he became religious to Zalman Bernstein, and his overriding passion was to create a foundation that was going to focus on strengthening Jewish continuity. The problem has always been, and the foundation also has financed reports that documented that what the most important things that people who care about strengthening Jewish continuity could do would be to send their children to Jewish day schools or to Jewish overnight camps. These were data-driven reports, and they persuaded the foundation and Mr. Bernstein that's what he should dedicate the foundation to. Mr. Bernstein also had heard what was written by journalists and others and critics about the Ford Foundation and drift away from donor intent that I described to you earlier. He bought it. He said he didn't want his money spent by people who didn't know him personally and who didn't believe in the same values that he had. So he did not himself make the decision to spend the foundation down. It was a foundation that had assets at its peak of about $1 billion. And they Mainly what they supported was the infrastructure for Jewish day schools and Jewish camping, overnight camping. Anybody who thinks that the problem of Jewish continuity is going to be solved in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years is not well informed by history. We know the problem has been around, the problems have been around for millennia, and nobody thinks that they can be solved in a short period of time. But that did not deter the board of the foundation after Mr. Bernstein died from deciding that they were going to spend the foundation down. And so I used that as an example of allowing speculation about what's going to happen to their philanthropic dollars after the donor dies trump the mission of the foundation itself. We know what he cared about, we know what the foundation was dedicated to, and we know that it takes a long time, it will take a long time to solve the problem of Jewish continuity. So it's a good example of how people can make the wrong decision even though their heart is in the foundation, because somebody has fed them a fiction about what has happened to other foundations in similar situations. So that's the lesson. And I write it something like the president of the foundation did not like the fact that I wrote it. He was ultimately the one who made the decision to spend down. But we're still friends, and I think he respects the fact that I have data on my side too of suggesting that they made a wrong decision.
Joel, earlier you mentioned that our discourse is richer for the variety of foundations that we have.
Yes.
We also see today, as perhaps in Lincoln's time, a polarized discourse. On the other hand, we see citizens perhaps more actively engaging in discourse than ever before. We have new platforms for citizen engagement. We see social movements created by citizens. But we also know from history that foundations play an important role in institutionalizing the types of change called for by citizens.
Right.
Joel, what role do you see for foundations, perpetual foundations, limited life, in harnessing this great civic activism that we see today and working together as foundations, collaborating?
Right.
We don't have much research on foundation collaboration. But what role do you see for foundations in harnessing this?
Well, I would simply strike from what you said the word perhaps. I mean, the fact of the matter is, anybody observing the scene involved in it at this point knows that there's been an outpouring of candidates and an outpouring of money into politics in opposition to what the right-wing Republicans and Trump have been doing. And you know, you've got at this point somebody gave me an exact figure, and I think it was 462 women candidates running for legislative office in the United States this election. That's unbelievably large compared to what has been the case in the past. In North Carolina, a group of private citizens created an organization basically that raised $35 million to finance the identification of candidates for public office, to provide research, to inform their statements, to fuel their campaigns. Some of that money is for-profit, tax benefited, like 501c3 stuff, and a large part of it is 501c4 stuff that is not tax benefited and which is used to finance campaigns. As a result of this, the Democratic Party in North Carolina has decided to put a Democratic candidate for every single state legislative office that is being elected. It's the first time in history that Democrats have put up candidates for every office in the state house, in the legislature, and in the upper house and the lower house, and for Congress. Typically, the conventional wisdom among campaign managers is to put your money where you think you have a chance to do it, but target the money to a few districts rather than to all the districts. That, of course, leaves out any possibility of chance. If you do all of them, you add some increment of the chance to benefit positions, capturing slots that you never would have gotten otherwise. If you don't put a candidate up for it, you're not going to get it by chance. So the notion that they are now literally every single race for the state legislature and for Congress has a Democrat in there running. That's been financed in large part by people. you look at that, and so I've witnessed personally the outpouring of money for the first time. It's never been like this in my lifetime. And I follow politics pretty carefully on the sidelines. I don't run for office. I think I have more important things to do in any event, things that are less taxing than running for office. But in any event, so you're getting that. So the question is, what can foundations do? Well, there's a section in the book in which I talk about collaborative grant making, which, you know, it's not the whole story, but starting with the grand bargain about Detroit, which was something that foundations typically would never have done. Preventing the bankruptcy of Detroit from robbing the workers of their pensions, and for selling all the art in the Detroit Art Institute. So they did come together, and with the leadership of Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation and Alberto Ibarguen at the Knight Foundation and Rip Rapson at the Kresge Foundation, they put up a lot of money. The Ford Foundation put up $125 million, and the Kresge Foundation put up $100 million, and the Knight Foundation put up $30 million. So, but there are good reasons for that being an unusual case. What are those reasons? Number one, the Ford Foundation is basically a creature of the Michigan law. That is, it is incorporated in Michigan, and the people, the Attorney General of Michigan, has never been happy with the portion of the Ford Foundation's grant making that went to Michigan. A lot of complaints about the fact they weren't giving their due to Michigan, though that's where it was incorporated. That explains the logic. It's not the reason, but it enabled the Ford Foundation to make a decision to put into $100 million into, that ended up being $130 million into the grand bargain. Why the Knight Foundation? The newspapers in Detroit were owned by the Knight Ridder newspapers. And why the Kresge Foundation? It's a large private foundation, the president of which had engaged fully in trying to improve circumstances in Michigan, transportation and everything else there. So there's a reason for it, but they made it very clear that this is not something they're going to do anywhere else. But you have that same section which deals with the grand bargain, lists something like 20 examples of 20 initiatives, collaborative initiatives among foundations that I could not have, when I wrote the book in 2006, 2007, I couldn't have given you more than 2 or 3, like the Energy Foundation. So, foundations are collaborating more often than they were before, and many foundations are engaging in advocacy in a way that they weren't before. If you got a living donor, what's the name of the guy who died yesterday? He was one of the founders of the Blackstone Group. I'm blacking Peterson. Pete Peterson. Well, Pete Peterson established a foundation, and because he cared a lot about national debt and the debt and the deficit, and he decided that he was I think the first to do this. He decided that he would not pay the president of the Peterson Foundation from the assets of the foundation. He would pay them from his after-tax dollars personally. So why is that important? It means that the president of a foundation that cannot lobby can lobby because he's not being paid by the foundation's money. Julian Robertson did exactly the same thing with his foundation. Exact same model. Paid the salary of the president out of his personal assets. Why did he do it? Because he came to the realization that the problems that he cared about, namely environmental pollution and other kinds of things, conservation, could not be dealt with only by foundations. They all required public action by Congress, and the only way you're going to get public action by Congress or the legislatures, basically, is to invest in lobbying. And so the president of this foundation that cannot itself lobby is lobbying. I was surprised that the IRS approved it, frankly, but they did. They've not backed away from it, and now you've had 3 directors of the IRS since then who have not lifted a finger about it. Nobody seems to be anxious about it. So you've got this almost crazy situation in which the president of an organization that can lobby because his salary is being paid by non-tax benefited dollars. So, and you also have situations in which foundations are themselves establishing 501c4s to do advocacy, which, again, most lawyers advising foundations are always very cautious about that, but that's not the case anymore. The sense is, if you look at the last thing I'll say about this is that when you think about the epilogue in this book, says to people who want to give away their money during their lifetimes, if you want to get the maximum amount of benefit and impact from your dollars that you want to spend in the short run, my advice to you is to give to politics. Because if you care about these issues, those legislative seats turn over every 2 years in the case of most state legislatures, every 2 years in the case of the House of Representatives in Congress, every 6 years. You can get, that's a window that you could really make a difference if you put money into it. And what we're seeing is more people are now putting money into politics than ever before, particularly on the left. The right has been doing it through the Koch brothers and their associates for 40 years. The left has never been doing it. Now there is an organization now called the Democracy Alliance, in which the participants in the Democracy Alliance are all liberal, and they're putting more money into politics than ever before. So, if somebody you don't get a tax deduction from whatever you do, contributing to political candidates, but if you're looking for impact, and if you're a liberal, it doesn't make sense not to do that. Because we're seeing a situation in which the polls are swinging strongly towards the possibility of a Democratic upset in 2018 midterm elections. And if the polls are right, and there seems to be a unanimity about it, no guarantee that they're right, but nonetheless, we could in fact see a situation in which the Democrats take control of. Was at dinner the other night, and a person dinner party, and the person asked, "What did you think the outcome was going to be?" And I would say the unanimous, with two exceptions, the unanimous group felt, the unanimous votes of the people present was that the Democrats would take control of the House of Representatives, and they would not take control of the U.S. Senate. But there were people who felt that we would take control of both. And you look at the state legislatures, which are now 36 of the state legislatures are controlled by Republicans, mainly right-wing Republicans. This has been the case all because of the gerrymandering that has occurred. We don't know what the Supreme Court is going to do at this point. If I had to bet on it, I would bet you that the Supreme Court is going to make a decision that's going to surprise a lot of people, given the conservative makeup, because of the fact that they will understand the damage that's been done through many of the decisions of the court with respect to things like the most recent case that permitted corporations to make contributions to politics. I think that the chairman of the Supreme, the presiding justice of the Supreme Court understands the problem. And my hope is that they will make decisions when they've got two important cases on gerrymandering and redistricting. Whether it's gerrymandering on political basis from Wisconsin, or gerrymandering on a racial basis from North Carolina and Michigan and Maryland. Those cases could if they could change the landscape even more strongly if they were to decide the way. There are three congressional districts in North Carolina that have been declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, affirmed by the Supreme Court unanimously. They haven't acted on the case about the implementation when that is to occur, but the idea that the Supreme Court voted unanimously to affirm those decisions is really a giveaway about what I think the court is going to do.
Well, I have one more question for you. The School of Philanthropy is currently celebrating our 30 years, first as a center, now as a school, and while we are celebrating our history, we're also looking to the future. And earlier today, you and I were talking about
the student body here, many of whom are millennials, and the energy that this generation has moving into the future. As you think to the future of philanthropy, and you think about the future of schools and institutes that are studying philanthropy, where should our focus be?
Everywhere. I mean, the answer is, you have a lot of young people who want to change the world for the better. You think about the number of startups. I can't predict, I'm not sure that the world of philanthropic startups is much different from the world of for-profit startups, in the sense that who knows where you put your money. First of all, you put it on things that people care about. Just, the secret, as Tom Tierney and I say in Give Smart, the most important thing about the philanthropic decision is to do what you really care about. Because if you don't do what you really care about, you're not going to give it your whole heart and the time you need to put into it to make a difference. And so, it's like start making for-profit startups. If you don't care about the product that you're trying to invent or whatever it is, you're not going to do a very good job of it. Same thing is true in philanthropy. So we have a new generation, ongoing generation of millennials, or whatever we're calling them now, who have a lot of energy, who want to change the world, who've heard about social entrepreneurship, and there are countless opportunities. And you read the books on social entrepreneurship about the kinds of things that young people have done, and it's astonishing. I mean, even give cash grants to villagers in Africa. Give Smart. I'm sorry, that's my book. Give Directly. It's a wonderful organization started by a PhD economist and his partner in Michael Fay and his partner, I can't remember what it was. Any event, this organization raises millions of dollars in the United States. It gives unrestricted cash grants to villagers in Africa. It does randomized controlled tests on what they do with their money and what they're finding, and they've now had those randomized control tests have all been done by independent organizations. What they find is that the people who get those grants use them, not the criticism of giving unrestricted money to poor people was they're going to spend it on alcohol, sex, or dope. It doesn't happen. They spend it on building their businesses, if they have a business, starting a business, if they don't have a business, getting better health care for their children, getting better health care for themselves. They know better about what they need money for than any bureaucrats do. So that's an amazing, and there's an interesting book which I commend to you if you're interested in that question. It's called Utopia for Realists, which was just published last year by a Dutchman, and it's in fact I assigned it to my class this year because it's such an interesting book. It reviews, we've been trying experiments on cash grants to poor people in the United States for almost 100 years at this point. Richard Nixon proposed to Congress a national program for Richard Nixon, whom nobody likes. Proposed a cash grant, an unrestricted cash grant program for poor people in the United States, which the House of Representatives passed and the Senate killed when Richard Nixon was president. There's so many interesting ideas floating around, and I have the students read that book because there are other ways that we haven't thought about doing social policy that we need to think about. So in any event, that's a long-winded answer to say there are more things that need to be done than there are people to do them. But the important thing is for people who care about those things to decide to make a career of it.
We're certainly supporting that here. Amir, do we have time for some questions
We
from
do,
the audience?
absolutely.
Let's open it up then.
I have a question. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Nan Edgerton. I'm a fundraiser at our law school here. My daughter is a public policy student at the Sanford School. And I have two questions. My background is higher education fundraising, working at community foundations here and in Virginia. And there's been an ongoing conversation in my professional life about what is the right amount, whatever right means, to start a private foundation. And I come at that from the standpoint of being a charitable advisor to people.
Right.
So that is my first question, and that's perhaps the easier one. My second question is a follow-up to your discussion about grants to poor people, and especially when we look at the impact of the Gates Foundation on philanthropy worldwide and their metrics-driven approach. My question to you is, I believe that that has really flown down to philanthropy in general, not only philanthropy from foundations, but also individual donors.
Right.
And so how do we balance that need for metrics and reporting with simple, good, honest, compassionate giving?
The answer is we balance it, but I'll come back to that in a minute. With respect to the minimum amount to establish a foundation, the
Private
foundation, I would say the going view of most people who have written on the subject is if you have less than $20 million in assets, you don't want to create it because the logistical requirements are such that you're just going to lose money. You will spend more money on the administration of the effort if you hire staff than you are on what you want to do good about. So I don't know anything, and if you have more than 20 million, depending on how much more, it's okay to start a foundation. That was before the days that we had donor-advised funds. With donor-advised funds, I'm not sure you can give away more than that. You can have more than that and use a donor-advised fund without creating a foundation. But in any event, my sense is, you all study philanthropy here, know more about some of these questions than I do. I would say, Patrick, is there a better, is there a more up-to-date view, or is the $20 million still the standard figure?
10, 15 years ago, excuse me, Bank of America said 10 million, so 20 million makes sense now.
Yeah. So the answer to your question about metrics is more difficult because we do know that it is that the foundations that have tried this seem to be able to do a better job in the sense of achieving the impacts that they set out to achieve if they are strategic, if they do generate metrics to figure out what it, and we know enough things from foundations, which foundations have, not many of them, but some of them have reluctantly posted the results of things that failed, which will prevent other people from doing the same kinds of things. The Irvine Foundation in California had an independent evaluation done of its largest program, and it was found to be a failure. And not only did they have the guts to do it and give the investigator, I don't remember who he was a national figure whom I admired at that point, I can't remember his name at this point. They posted it on their website. So, in a sense, if they hadn't done that, other people would have been tempted to model what they wanted to do on the problem by what the Irvine Foundation was doing. But when the data came out, it discouraged people from doing that. They don't. So you don't reinvent the wheel if the wheel is broken. And we don't know enough about foundation failures. We still don't, in my view. And what's more, you not only don't know enough about foundation failures, even with the things that foundations could regard themselves as succeeding in, things that they are proud of that they did, you don't have the blueprints. So you can't, and if the idea of foundations as being priming the pump, modeling, experimenting with things, and then other people picking them up on the basis of what they've done, we don't have enough data to be able to do that because the foundations don't provide that data. They will not give you the data. And I can say that from my personal experience in Atlantic, working with other foundations, where every foundation regards its data as proprietary. And you can have in some cases, 3 foundations, including us, giving a grant to a same organization, and the other foundations unwilling to give us evaluations as they commissioned on that grant. We offered to give our evaluations to anybody. They said no, they wouldn't give us their evaluations. There's a kind of a turf protection, a protection Why? And it's just, it's there. I understand some of their reluctance, but I think it's a really pernicious policy.
Other questions, Mickey? And please do introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Mickey Levitan, I'm a visiting fellow here. Got a chance to meet Joel a little earlier. Thanks for your comments. So I think Give Smart ought to be required reading for any new philanthropist. You know, with all the money now that's moving into donor-advised funds, there's a question about how folks are getting the kind of advice and the guidance and screening and filtering and so forth to make smart philanthropic choices. You know, for better or for worse, when money went through foundations, there were professional staffs and, you know, an accumulation of knowledge. And I worry that the flow of resources to the DAFs is outpacing the ability to provide the level of kind of guidance and support so that they don't end up, so new philanthropists don't end up repeating mistakes around things that have already been figured out before. Can you comment on this and where do you think things are going?
I'll be glad to, Mickey. I think, you know, we've seen one thing I talk about in the book, which is I didn't say in my remarks here, is that at the same time you've had this growth in giving, you've also had a growth in the profession of philanthropic advisors. So, you know, starting with Peter Karoff, who unfortunately died recently, founded the Philanthropy Initiative in Boston, TPI, you began to have these organizations. It was started first as a profit-making organization, and he very quickly came to the conclusion that he couldn't make any profit with it, so he got foundations to provide support to TPI. But so they converted to a tax-exempt organization, and it did succeed. And at its peak, when Peter was still alive and running it, they were giving away money. They were advising their clients to give away about $100 million a year, or something like that. Well, you've got Arabella in Chicago, you've got Rockefeller Philanthropic Advisors in New York, which is sort of the gold standard of them, most expensive, but also very good, which offers a full suite of services, not just managing. So, you know, and a number of the financial institutions are taking seriously the need to have people on their staff who know something about philanthropic giving. So while it is true that we're giving away more money now, we also have more people giving advice to donors about how best to achieve impact with it. You know, Tom Tierney at Bridgespan does that almost full time now, and many of his clients are principal major billionaires, basically. Bridgespan was started by foundations in the year 2000, and the foundations that supported it thought that giving them a grant of $15 million was adequate to support them for a 7-year period. Today, Bridgespan is earning $40 million a year in fees from mainly from foundations, but often for foundations in behalf of their grantees. So, and it's expanded. You've got other organizations like that that do exactly the same thing. So my sense is that a number of students at the Sanford School are interested in that, and they go to work for Bridgespan or one of the other organizations, consulting organizations, focused primarily. Bridgespan supports does work only for nonprofits and for foundations or individual philanthropists, and so do other consulting advisors. So my sense is, you know, that donors who want to give away a lot of money have access to the idea of Bridgespan in the first place was to provide access to the same quality of consulting advice that the typical Forbes 400 organization could get by paying for it from any number of Boston Consulting Group or McKinsey or whatever. My point is, I don't think that's a problem. I think for anybody who wants advice about how to give away their money, there's plenty of advice. They don't always want advice, as you know, and they don't always take the advice that they get. But nonetheless, the advice is there, and that seems to me to be enough comfort for most people.
Other questions?
Well, as Katie, the dean said, I'm happy to sign books for anybody who wants to buy one, and I'll be sitting here to midnight if necessary. If there any of you want to do it. So what I suggest is, I'm going to pull up my chair. There's a brave lady